What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? This is Mike coming at you from everydaycarryconcealed.com. Today, wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about how to operate the trigger on your firearm. So, there's a lot of different terms and things that get thrown around in the community. Pull, press, squeeze. So, I just wanted to talk about each of those terms, which one I prefer and why. And sort of my philosophy behind the whole chosen vernacular, and also show you exactly how to operate the trigger. So if you're with someone who's new on the range, if you're struggling with your own accuracy and marksmanship, what are some things that you might be looking for? So what this video isn't going to be about is not going to be about trigger discipline, okay? I'm not going to be talking to you about keeping your finger off the trigger and all that. Literally, I'm talking about when you're in the process of shooting, okay? How do you get the most accurate shot group based upon how you are manipulating the trigger? I'm assuming that you have proper sight alignment, proper sight picture. All of that is perfect, okay? What comes next is the actual operation of the trigger and how to optimize what you're doing there. Okay, so when we're talking about how to manipulate the trigger, there's really three terms that are thrown around in the community for how to properly operate the trigger on a firearm. Those three terms are pull, press, and squeeze. So I am going to talk about which one I prefer and why, but I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of each. So the first is pull. Pull is probably the most common term when it comes to talking about operating the trigger. To me, pull is a very aggressive term. When I think of something like tug of war, I am pulling aggressively. Generally, when you are pulling on something, it's lack of control. It's all brute force. So you are not maintaining control of how much pressure or force that you're applying. And for that reason, I think that it is not conducive to accurate shooting. Generally, there's more force than is required to actually complete the job when you're pulling the trigger. You're also, you lack control. You're probably accelerating through all of the different steps that you should be taking during firing a shot. And so pull, while used commonly, is not something that I'm a huge fan of, particularly when it comes to marksmanship. So next on the list, we have press. Press is usually reserved for actions that are taken away from the body. You know, you're pressing the key on a keyboard, you're pressing the button on an elevator. And so conceptually, for a new shooter, that can be confusing, right? You're now taking an example or a term that's used for actions that are away from the body and then trying to apply that same logic for an action that is moving towards your body. Now, press generally is a little bit better about the control of force. So when I'm pressing an elevator button, I don't jam my finger into the button as hard as I can, right? I'm using just enough force to get it to light up. So in that regard, I think that press can be a useful tool in explaining how to operate the trigger to a new shooter. Now, by far, I think that the best term is squeeze. So the squeeze is a good use for operating the trigger because it shows restraint and control throughout the entire process of the movement of the trigger, and then it also is focused mostly on the finger, the actual trigger finger. So, as an example, think about an eyedropper, and this was regurgitated to me. This is not a new thing, right? This is what I was instructed on, and it made sense to me. But if you take an eyedropper and you're putting the drops in your eye and you're gently squeezing that bottle just enough so that that drop comes out and goes into your eye. Immediately following that, you actually back off the pressure, because if you maintain the pressure that was enough to get the drop to come out, another drop's going to come out. Okay? And when you're shooting, it's the same concept. Now, one thing that squeezing can be confusing for someone who is a little bit more experienced is they will, during the trigger break, they will actually, instead of focusing that energy through their finger, they will actually apply it to the whole hand. And so when you're firing, if you're squeezing with your whole hand, it's called milking. But when you squeeze with the whole hand, that obviously is going to adjust your sight alignment or sight picture, ultimately leading to shots that are not placed in the correct spot. So none of these terms are perfect, right? It's whatever makes sense to the shooter, whether that's you or someone that you're helping to instruct. The idea is that you want to be controlled throughout the entire process of the movement of the trigger, and you don't want to use excessive force. You don't want to be accelerating through each of those steps needlessly. So let's talk about the steps for actually firing a shot. What are you supposed to be doing to that trigger? So there are fundamentally 5 steps when you're operating your trigger, okay? The first is you're going to take up the slack. The amount of slack is the movement before you actually start to apply the pressure to the mechanism that actually controls the hammer or the striker or whatever, okay? Each firearm will have a different amount of slack. 1911 has significantly less than a Glock. Varies by make and model, okay? But you want to take up the slack. Once you've taken up the slack, you'll reach a thing called the wall. So the wall is where you start to feel that resistance of the trigger, okay? It's usually a sticking point on a lot of triggers. You're not going to be able to move through it unless you add additional pressure, okay? Once you reach the wall, you're going to apply steady pressure through the wall until you reach the next step, which is the trigger break. The trigger break obviously is when the hammer falls, the striker hits the firing, the striker initiates the firing pin. It's when the shot actually occurs. And then immediately following that, you're going to actually back off your pressure, okay? So you're not following the pressure through the trigger break and then continuing that pressure on. You actually want to back off ever so slightly on that pressure, and that helps with things like trigger reset later on. It prevents you from dipping the muzzle or raising the muzzle, whatever the case may be, depending on what your hands are, or what your hands and your trigger finger are doing. So 5 steps: take up the slack, hit the wall, apply pressure through the wall, trigger break, release pressure. All right. So I've actually got 2 different handguns here. So the first is my Glock, which is empty. And so for you to see, whoops, I guess this would be a better angle. For you to see, so right now I've got my finger on the trigger, okay? I'm taking up the slack, right here. I feel that wall. I'm starting to get that resistance, okay? Once I get that resistance, I'm going to apply pressure, break, and then I'm going to ever so slightly back off. It was almost imperceptible. You may have just seen the fingertip move. But that is essentially the steps. Now I've also got my 380, which is also empty. Okay, so on this one, the hammer is back, all right? All right, so on this one, you can actually see a decent amount of movement before I hit that wall, right? That's the wall. Now, once I hit the wall, I'm going to apply pressure, break, and let off ever so slightly. Okay? So now, regardless of whether you're running a single action or a double action trigger, right? So right now, this is why I chose the 380, is because I'm actually in double action. So you'll see there's still that slack to take up. Actually, there's probably more in double action before I hit the wall. Now, the concept is the same even with double action on this pistol, is that I hit the wall and then I pull through. The difference is that as you see that as I apply that pressure, there's that slow, steady movement of the hammer until I reach the back, and then I push through that and break. Okay? So, sorry. So, those are the 5 steps. And when you talk about squeezing the trigger, that's that whole steady pressure until you reach the break. So again, if a new shooter is having trouble conceptually with the term squeeze, I may switch up the term that I use, but it's only to aid them in conceptually realizing what I'm trying to convey to them without getting them to do something that is going to cause an errant shot. All right, so now I'm going to show you sort of some of the results using the Mantis X system. So the Mantis X system is something that you can attach to the rail on your firearm, and it will record a set amount of time before, during, and after the trigger break. All right, so I've got the Mantis X on my Glock right now, and I'm going to show you the results of what happens when you use a pull versus a squeeze. And it'll be reflected not only in the score, but I'll also show you guys after the fact sort of the movement of the muzzle before, during, and after the break. All right, so again, I'm not aiming down sight. I'm not looking at my front sight post. I'm really focusing on my trigger and trying to interact with the camera as well as, show you accurately the different steps of not only the trigger squeeze, but also, maintaining all of that simultaneously and pointing to the scores and stuff is a little bit difficult. So bear with me on this. All right. So, empty. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to actually, I'm going to go ahead and do a pull for the first couple. So instead of, hitting the wall and doing all that, I'm just going to basically rush through, accelerate through. That's the worst score I've ever gotten. Hope it doesn't skew my numbers too much. Okay. Again, I'll do it a little bit slower this time, but I'm not going to go through the steps of, taking up the slack and all that. I'm literally just going to go through a pull. Okay, 82.3, that's not bad. So again, I'm not going through taking up the slack. I'm not hitting the wall. I'm not pausing at the wall. I'm not pushing steadily through the wall until the break during any of this, and I'm definitely not releasing the pressure. All right, so now I'm actually going to go through the squeeze, and let's see if we get a little bit more. So take up the slack, hit the wall, slow, 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 slow. 90.3, a little bit better, right? All right, let's do it one more time and see if we can get a little bit better score. 98.9. So the difference in my best score versus my best score doing a pull method, drastically different. 98.9, I mean, that's pretty good, all things considered, right? Versus an 82, that's almost 20%, because it's out of 100, it's almost a 20% difference. So if you can get 20% less variance in your shot, depending on the distance that you're shooting, obviously, that's going to make a drastic difference in your grouping. And so that's why squeezing the trigger and going through the proper steps is so important. All right, so now that we've done that registered because it's silly. All right, so the important thing to look at here is the yellow on this chart. So the yellow is actually during the break, okay? And so this was that first shot. This was that 25.5. That's pretty gnarly, okay? The blue and the red, I forget which one it is pre and post trigger break. So it went off the chart, which is why I got a 25.5. Anyways, so that's the first one. The second one, okay, so now we're looking, that's a little bit better, right? That yellow squiggly line is not nearly as variant as it was in that first one. All right, so then we'll go to the third shot. Now you'll see a much more condensed, right? That yellow line, there's some arc of movement that can't be avoided because we're human. We've got blood pumping through our veins. We have oxygen flowing through. We're breathing, right? So there's going to be some movement. You're never going to have a dot for yellow. It's just not going to happen because everyone moves. All right. And then we go to number 4. And again, you've got a little bit of lateral movement. You almost can't even see the yellow. It's a very minimal line, okay? And that's what you're going for, and that's what squeezing the trigger will give you, all right? So, again, I'm not tied. Let me get this out of the way. I'm not tied to any particular vocabulary when I'm instructing. I'm trying to convey the message of this is what you're supposed to be doing. This is how the trigger is supposed to operate. And whatever you can do to minimize the movement during that process, that's what I want. Okay, so we've talked about, and I've shown you the examples of this. Now, before all of the military guys, the law enforcement guys, the tactical Joes out there get on my case about, oh yeah, it's all well and good to go through all of those steps when you're trying to shoot at a piece of paper, but what happens when there's an attacker? That is a very fair point. Trying to perform this process when your life is on the line, when there is an imminent threat to you, when your adrenaline is pumping, your blood pressure and your heart rate are up, time may be of the essence, absolutely, it becomes significantly more difficult to go through each of these steps. And at that point, you may be pulling the trigger, okay? However, if you train to squeeze the trigger, if you train to minimize the amount of movement because of your trigger control, then when you are in a situation where time is of the essence, where you have all of these additional factors, presumably that is when muscle memory should kick in, right? If you practice expert marksmanship whenever you're on the range, then your degree of variance when all of these other factors are contributing to the situation should be less, okay? So yes, I understand fully that in a high stress situation that it is not feasible to go through all of these steps. However, when you're on the range and those aren't an issue, you should be focusing on squeezing the trigger. You should be focusing on going through each of these steps and not just pulling the trigger to get that shot down range because it's going to hit the paper target that's 5 yards in front of you. Like, that is not the point of range time if you are trying to become proficient with your firearm for self-defense, home protection, whatever the case may be, or if you're trying to become a competition shooter. Like, you need to focus on fine-tuning your trigger control, okay? So, again, guys, I've explained sort of my philosophy on the different terms for pull versus press versus squeezing the trigger. I think that squeeze is an accurate representation and, more importantly, reinforces some of those key components of properly operating the trigger. You guys can disagree. If you do, I'd be more than happy to hear comments. If you agree, give the video a like, subscribe. That would be awesome too. But again, this was just sort of my approach to how I would instruct someone and sort of the constant reminders that I have to give myself when I am on the lanes. So hopefully you guys enjoyed. Like and subscribe. Appreciate you checking out the video, and I will catch you next time.